The sun was a hammer, and the parade ground of Fort Chastity was its anvil. Dust, fine as ground bone, rose with every gust of wind, coating everything in a layer of pale brown grit. It clung to the sweat on Jonah's neck, caked the brim of his hat, and settled in the lines around his eyes, lines etched not by age, but by things seen and things done. He kept his horse to a slow walk, a shadow passing through a settlement that buzzed with the cruel energy of bored men given too much power. In the center of that ground was the reason for the buzz. A girl. She was staked to the earth, spread-eagled under the merciless sky. Rawhide strips, dark with sweat and blood, bound her wrists and ankles to iron pegs driven deep into the baked ground. Her black hair fanned out around her head, like a spill of ink in the dust. From a distance, she was a broken doll. But as Jonah drew closer, he saw the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. A knot of soldiers loitered nearby, seeking shade under a canvas awning. One of them, a corporal with a mean, pinched face, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the girl's head. He noticed Jonah watching, and a smirk twisted his lips. "Take a good look, stranger." The corporal, Barracks, called out, his voice carrying a taunt. "That's what happens when you put a curse on the United States Army. Colonel Rourke, he don't abide witches." Jonah's gaze shifted from the girl to Barracks, then back to the girl. He should have kept riding. His business here was simple: bullets, flour, whiskey. This was not his business. Every instinct, honed by years of survival, screamed at him to turn his horse and disappear. But then he made the mistake of looking at her face. It was turned to the side, her cheek pressed into the hot dust. Her eyes were open. They weren't staring at the soldiers or the sky. They were looking straight at him. There was no plea in them, no fear, just an unnerving intensity, a searing focus that burned through the heat haze and straight into the hollow space where his soul used to be. It held him fast. The ghosts in his memory stirred. A burning barn. A promise he'd failed to keep. "Damn it all," Jonah whispered to his horse. He swung down from the saddle. The moment his boots hit the ground, the mood shifted. The lazy cruelty of the soldiers solidified into watchful suspicion. As Jonah started walking toward the girl, Barracks and two other soldiers moved to intercept him, stepping away from the shade and into the blinding sun. "That's far enough," Barracks said, blocking Jonah's path. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol. "This is official army business. Turn your horse and ride on out." Jonah didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the girl beyond them. "I'm not looking for trouble. Corporal? Well, you're walking right into it." Another soldier sneered. "She's the colonel's property now, until the sun says otherwise." Jonah took another step forward, his intention clear. Barracks shoved a hand against Jonah's chest to stop him. "Are you deaf, old man? I gave you an order." It happened faster than the eye could follow. Jonah's hand wasn't a blur. It simply ceased to be at his side and appeared, holding the Colt from his hip. There was no grand motion, just an impossible economy of movement. The bang of the pistol was deafening in the still air. None of the soldiers were hit. Barracks flinched violently, his hand flying to his face, but he was unharmed. 20 feet away, another soldier who had been leaning against a post, raising a tin cup of water to his lips, froze in shock. The cup, now with a neat, round hole through its center, dropped from his nerveless fingers and clattered in the dust, its precious water spreading into a dark stain. Silence. Absolute. Ringing silence. The soldiers stared, not at Jonah's gun, which was already resting calmly at his side again, but at the fallen cup. They were military men, trained to fight. They knew what that shot meant. It wasn't just speed, It was a level of precision under pressure that was terrifying. It was a message, delivered more clearly than any words. I could have put that bullet between any of your eyes. I still can. Maddox slowly lowered his hand from his face, his bravado shattered, replaced by a mixture of fury and raw, primal fear. He was humiliated, but he was also alive, and he understood the choice he'd just been given. Jonah's voice, when he spoke, was deadly calm. "I'm done talking." He walked forward. This time, no one stopped him. The soldiers parted, their fear a palpable thing in the air. He knelt beside a pony, the silent standoff continuing at his back. He pulled his hunting knife. Its rasping sound as he sawed through the first rawhide bond was unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. He cut one wrist free, then the other, then her ankles. The soldiers watched, rooted to the spot, trapped between the terror of defying this deadly stranger and the future terror of facing Colonel Rourke's wrath. Jonah sheathed his knife and gently slid his arms under the girl, lifting her from the ground. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of sharp bones and surprising heat. Her head lolled against his shoulder in exhaustion. He turned and walked back toward his horse, carrying her. He moved with deliberate slowness, giving them every chance to be brave. None were. Maddox's face was a thunderous mask of hate, but his pistol remained in its holster. Jonah lifted her onto his horse, settling her in front of the saddle before swinging up behind her. Her limp form rested against his chest. He gathered the reins, his back exposed to a dozen rifles. For a long second, he waited for the shot that would end it all. It never came. He nudged his horse into a walk, then a trot, heading for the open, lawless expanse beyond the fort. He hadn't just uncuffed a girl. He had faced down a dozen soldiers without killing a single one, leaving behind a corporal burning with humiliation and a garrison that now had to explain to the fearsome Colonel Gideon Rourke how they had allowed his living curse to be stolen from under their noses. He had just unleashed hell, and it was now riding in his saddle. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that another, more furious hell was about to come chasing after him. Jonah felt every one of them on his back. The pursuit began less than an hour after they cleared the shadow of Fort Chastity. It wasn't a wild, disorganized posse. It was the cold, efficient machinery of Colonel Gideon Rourke. A dust cloud on the horizon, too uniform to be the wind, resolved itself into a dozen mounted soldiers, their movements precise, their pace relentless. Jonah pushed his horse, a sturdy buckskin that had carried him through worse, but the animal was now carrying double, and the girl was a dead weight against him. Her initial collapse had given way to a shallow, feverish state of unconsciousness. He had her lashed to him with a length of rope to keep her from falling, her head bumping gently against his collarbone with every jarring stride. He was a gunman, a survivor. His instincts screamed for him to find a defensible position, a rocky outcrop or a narrow canyon where he could make a stand. Use his Colt and Winchester to even the odds. That was the military way. That was the only way he knew. But the land here was flat, offering nothing but sun-baked earth and sparse, thorny scrub. To stop was to die. He fled into a landscape of shattered rock and winding arroyos, the Badlands a chaotic maze that might confuse pursuit. The sun beat down, and the water in his canteen sloshed with a diminishing rhythm that echoed his own dwindling hope. By late afternoon, the girl began to stir. She didn't wake with a cry or a gasp, but with a sudden, silent stillness. He felt her stiffen against him, her body coming alive, her head lifted. He felt her gaze scanning the back trail, though he couldn't see her face. "They're still coming," he grunted, stating the obvious. "Half day behind, maybe less." She said nothing. Instead, she shifted, and with a strength that belied her frail appearance, she pushed herself upright. She touched the rope binding her to him, a clear, questioning gesture, cursing his own caution. He leaned forward and sawed through it with his knife. She was free, but she made no move to leave. She sat astride the horse in front of him, her back straight, a silhouette of impossible endurance. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, Jonah knew he had to stop. The horse was trembling with exhaustion. He reined in at the mouth of a shallow, dry wash, its sandy bottom offering some concealment. He slid from the saddle, his own legs aching, and reached up to help her down. She refused his hand, sliding to the ground with a lithe movement that was almost soundless. She landed on her feet and stood for a moment, swaying, her eyes closed. He thought she would collapse again. Instead, she took a deep breath, and it seemed to draw a primal strength from the cooling earth itself. While Jonah unsaddled the weary horse and led it to a patch of dry grass, a pony began to move. He watched her, bewildered. Pity was a useless emotion in the West, but he had felt something akin to it for her. Now, that feeling was being replaced by a profound unease. She wasn't acting like a victim recovering from a trauma. She was acting like a hunter assessing her territory. Her movements were economical and silent. She gathered a handful of broad, gray-green leaves from a bush he'd have overlooked, crushed one, and sniffed it intently before rubbing them carefully over the raw, weeping wounds on her wrists. She found a loose stone, its edge sharp as a blade, and used it to dig at the base of a thorny plant, prying out a pale, lumpy root. She brought it to him, holding it out. He stared at it blankly. She gestured to the root, then to her mouth, then to his. "Eat it," he asked, skeptical. She gave a single sharp nod. Her eyes, which he could now see clearly in the gloaming, were dark and deep as a well. They held no warmth, only a fierce, practical intelligence. Trusting an instinct he didn't know he had, he took the root. It was starchy and bitter, but it quenched the gnawing emptiness in his gut. Later, as a sliver of moon rose, she did something that truly unnerved him. Rourke's men would be cold camping, but they would have sentries. Sound carried for miles in the clear night air. Jonah was preparing to spend a sleepless night, Winchester in his lap, when a pony touched his arm. She pointed toward a narrow split in the wall of the wash he hadn't noticed. It was barely a crack, shadowed and deep. She gestured for him to follow. Inside, the air was cool. The fissure opened into a small, hidden alcove, completely invisible from the main wash. The horse could be tethered deep inside, its sounds muffled by the rock. How had she known it was there? He had ridden these lands for years, and his eyes were sharp, but he had missed it completely. She moved through the darkness as if she could see the currents of the wind, her bare feet making no sound on the sandy floor. It was a savage silence, an eerie, almost supernatural attunement to the world around her. He was a trespasser here. She was a part of it. He began to understand. The soldiers hadn't staked a girl in their camp. They had staked a piece of the wilderness itself, and it had been a profound mistake. He had looked at her and seen a helpless native girl, a symbol for his own past failures. He had acted to save her, to soothe the ghost that rode on his shoulder. But as he sat in the secret dark of the alcove, listening to her steady, quiet breathing, he realized he hadn't rescued her at all. He had simply cut her tethers. She was now leading him. He was following the vengeful spirit of the land, and he had no idea where it was taking him. He was no longer the rescuer. He was just the man with the gun, a tool she had acquired for a purpose he could not yet fathom. They found refuge in the bones of the earth. For 2 days, a pony led them deeper into a labyrinth of canyons, a place where the pursuit of Rourke's men became a distant, frustrated echo. She moved with a purpose that left no room for doubt, her uncanny knowledge of the land their only shield. She found water seeping from rock faces, pointed out game trails, and always chose the path that left the faintest sign. Jonah, the seasoned survivor, found himself demoted to a simple pack mule, carrying their meager supplies while she read the land like a book written in a language he'd never learned. Their sanctuary was a shallow cave carved into a cliff face by ancient winds, overlooking a narrow, winding canyon. It was defensible, hidden, and for the first time in days, it felt safe. The tension that had kept Jonah's shoulders hunched and his hand near his Colt finally eased. It was in this quiet that the other wounds, the ones that didn't bleed, began to ache. A pony sat by the small, smokeless fire she'd built, tending to her wrists. The poultices of crushed leaves had worked a miracle, reducing the swelling and staving off infection, but the flesh was still a raw, ugly map of her ordeal. She worked with an intense, detached focus, as if the wounds belonged to someone else. Jonah watched her, cleaning his Winchester for the 10th time, the familiar methodical action a comfort. He noticed she favored her left hand. Her right hand, while functional, trembled slightly when she tried to do delicate work. He saw her wince as she tried to retie a bandage. Without thinking, he put his rifle aside and moved to her side. "Here," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, her dark eyes guarded. He gestured to the strip of cloth and the raw wrist. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a silent debate raging behind her eyes, before she gave a slow, reluctant nod. She extended her arm. He knelt before her, taking her hand. It was small and bird-like in his own calloused grip. He worked carefully, cleaning the wound with a precious bit of whiskey from his flask and a clean rag, his movements gentle. He could feel the fine tremor in her fingers. He wrapped the bandage, his touch light but firm. When he was done, he didn't let go immediately. A strange stillness settled between them, and then her gaze dropped from his face to his hand, the one holding hers. With her free hand, she reached out, and her finger, light as a feather, traced a faint white line across the back of his knuckles. It was an old scar, barely visible, a ghost of a wound from a lifetime ago. The touch was electric. The cave, the canyon, the girl, it all dissolved. The air filled with the smell of hay and terror. He was somewhere else, another time. A barn in the red clay hills of Georgia. The air was thick with smoke, the wood screaming as it burned. He was younger then, filled with the righteous fire of the Union cause. His orders had been clear: burn the barn, destroy the sympathizers' supplies. But the orders hadn't mentioned the family locked in the root cellar beneath it. He heard their screams, muffled by the floorboards. He saw the face of his commanding officer, a man with eyes as dead as stones, telling him to hold the line, that it was a tragedy of war. Jonah had hesitated, his rifle in his hands, torn between duty and decency. His hand, the one with the scar, had been gripping a fallen beam, trying to pry open the cellar doors as the flames licked at his uniform. A piece of the burning roof collapsed. A flaming plank had struck his hand, searing it, forcing him back. He failed. The screams faded into the roar of the inferno. He had stood there, clutching his burned hand, listening to the silence that followed. The ghost of that failure had haunted him ever since. He flinched back from a pony as if her touch was fire, snatching his hand away. He scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cave swam back into focus. A pony hadn't moved. She was watching him, her head tilted slightly, but her expression had changed. The guarded neutrality was gone, replaced by something that looked unnervingly like understanding. She had not seen a scar. She had seen the story behind it. She slowly lifted her own hand, the one he had just bandaged, and held it up between them. Then she pointed from her wounded wrist to his eyes. The gesture was unmistakable. "Your wound is here." The air went out of him. This whole time, he had seen himself as her rescuer, his act of cutting her free a small, desperate attempt to balance the scales of his own damned soul. He thought he was saving her to pay for the ghosts of the people he had failed to save. He saw it now as a pathetic, selfish act of penance. Aponi saw something else. She didn't see a rescuer. She saw a man as staked and tormented as she had been. Only his prison was not of iron pegs and rawhide, but of memory. His torment was not the sun, but the ghost in his own eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw not a victim, not a spirit of the land, but a person who had looked past his gun, past his hardened exterior, and had seen the rot inside him. And in her gaze, there was no pity. There was only a quiet, profound recognition, a shared language of loss that needed no words. He had cut her bonds, and in return, she had just shown him his own. The understanding that passed between them in the cave changed nothing, and yet it changed everything. The silence that followed was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken weight. They were two ghosts now, haunting the canyons together. Jonah's personal quest for redemption felt small and selfish next to the stark reality of her survival. He stopped seeing his past in her suffering, and started seeing her. Aponi, a person with a will of iron and a purpose he was only just beginning to grasp. She was the one who decided when it was time to move. On the fourth morning, she stood at the mouth of the cave, sniffing the air like an animal sensing a change in the season. She turned to him, her face grim, and pointed southeast. It was not a suggestion. They traveled for another day, descending from the high, rocky labyrinth into a greener, more gentle land of rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. It was a place that should have felt alive, but there was a deep sickness to it. The grass was patchy and yellowed, the trees seemed brittle, and the air carried a faint, metallic tang. They came upon a stream, its water unnaturally clear, its banks lined with the bleached skeletons of small animals and birds. A lone deer lay dead by the water's edge, its body bloated and untouched by scavengers. Jonah knelt, dipping his fingers in the water. It felt slick, wrong. "Don't drink it," he said, his voice low. Aponi was already standing by the dead deer, her hand resting on its matted flank. Her face was a mask of cold fury. This was what she had been leading him to. This was the source of the sickness. She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd cut her free, she spoke. Her voice was not what he expected. It wasn't the broken whisper of a victim. It was low and clear, though roughened by disuse, and it carried the weight of generations. "It is the spring," she said, the English words carefully chosen, deliberate. "The heart of our land. It is where the spirit of the mountain gives life." She swept her arm out, indicating the dead landscape. "Now, it gives only death." Jonah stood up, his mind racing. This wasn't a natural blight. This was deliberate. "Rourke," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the poisoned water. "He wants the land, but he does not want my people on it. He cannot kill us all with bullets. The men from the east would send papers and questions. So he kills the land instead. He poisons the heart. When the heart dies, the body follows." The full monstrous scope of it hit Jonah with the force of a physical blow. The staked girl, the relentless pursuit, It wasn't about a curse or a pouch of bad medicine. That was a story, a justification for the soldiers. The truth was far more venal, far more evil. This was a slow, calculated extermination. Why? Jonah asked, though he already suspected the answer. Greed was the only god that commanded this kind of devotion. The rock here bleeds silver, Aponi said, her voice laced with contempt. Rourke saw it. He wants it for himself. He told Washington this land is empty, barren, a lie to hide his greed. The hell he thought he had unleashed by freeing her was nothing compared to this. The hell was already here, seeping into the earth, crawling up the roots of the trees, flowing in the clear. Deadly water of the spring. Colonel Gideon Rourke wasn't just a murderer or a tyrant. He was a man willing to poison the very source of life for personal gain, hiding his crime behind the shield of his uniform. The soldiers hunting them weren't just enforcing military law. They were burying the evidence. And Aponi was the last person who could bear witness. They staked me, she continued, her gaze turning from the stream to him, because I saw them. Maddox and 2 others. They came in the night, with heavy barrels. They poured their poison into the mouth of the spring, the place where the water leaves the rock. I was hidden. I watched them defile our mother. Now he understood the living curse. To Rourke and Maddox, she wasn't a witch. She was a witness, a loose end. By leaving her to die under the sun, they could claim it was divine judgment, nature taking its own. No bullet holes, no blame. Jonah looked from the dead deer to the poisoned water, then to the girl standing before him. The ghost of the Georgia barn receded, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. His quest for redemption had been a selfish, wandering thing. Aponi had just given it a name, a face, and a direction. It was the face of Colonel Gideon Rourke. "What is your name?" he asked, the question suddenly vital. "Aponi," she said. "Jonah." He offered his own name like a pledge. "Well, Aponi, it seems Colonel Rourke has a problem. He didn't kill his witness. And now she's not alone." Jonah expected their next destination to be a place of mourning, a ruined village, a collection of fresh graves. He was prepared for sorrow. He was not prepared for what Aponi showed him. She led him away from the poisoned stream, up into a series of densely wooded hills that the sickness had not yet reached. The path was invisible, a route that existed only in her memory. She paused at a wall of rock covered in thick ivy, pushed the curtain of green aside, and revealed a dark, narrow opening. A cave. But this one had the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke and life. She entered without hesitation. Jonah followed, his hand on his Colt, every instinct on high alert. The passage opened into a vast, hidden grotto, lit by shafts of sunlight filtering through fissures high above, and it was filled with people. Not a large group, perhaps 30 souls in all. The old, the very young, and a few women and men of fighting age. They were thin, their faces etched with worry, but their eyes held the same resilient fire he'd seen in Aponi's. An elderly man with a face like a dried apple, his hair long and white, stepped forward. He looked at Jonah, his gaze sharp and assessing. Then he looked at Aponi. A silent conversation passed between them. The old man, who Aponi introduced only as the elder, turned his piercing gaze back to Jonah. "You have brought our butterfly home," he said in the same careful, accented English as Aponi. "For this, we thank you." Jonah shook his head. "She brought me. I just cut the ropes." The elder smiled, a faint, sad creasing of the skin around his eyes. "Sometimes, that is the most important task. But you misunderstand. Aponi was not captured by chance." A cold knot formed in Jonah's stomach. He looked at Aponi. She stood beside the elder, her expression unreadable, but she did not deny it. "We knew Rourke was poisoning the spring," the elder explained, his voice a low, patient murmur. "We saw the sickness in the land, but we had no proof, nothing to show the men from the east. Rourke controls this territory. His word is law, and his law is a lie. We needed something more than the word of a dying people." He gestured to Aponi. "She is the swiftest and the cleverest among us. She knows the soldiers' patrols. She knows the fort. She went on a mission, a desperate one, to get inside the fort, to find something, a map, a letter, an official report, anything that would prove Rourke knows about the silver and is acting on his own." Jonah's world tilted on its axis. The entire narrative he had built in his mind crumbled to dust. The helpless girl, the chance encounter, his grand act of rescue, all of it was a lie. He hadn't found a victim. He had stumbled into the middle of a spy mission. "She carried a pouch," Jonah said, the words coming out slowly as the pieces clicked into place. Maddox called it bad medicine. Aponi finally spoke, her voice firm. "It held dried herbs from the poisoned water, and a chip of rock, stained with the poison, not a curse, proof. She allowed herself to be seen, to be caught near the fort," the elder continued. "She knew they would not shoot her. Rourke is too clever for that. A body with a bullet hole raises questions. A witch dying of thirst is an act of God. It was her only way to get the proof past their guards. She hoped they would take the pouch and keep it in an office, as evidence of her crime." Jonah stared at her, a profound sense of awe mixing with the sting of his own foolish pride. Her ordeal, the stakes, the sun, the thirst. She had walked into it willingly. The unnerving intensity in her eyes when he'd first seen her wasn't just defiance. It was focus. It was the fierce concentration of a soldier on a mission, willing to sacrifice herself for her people. "But the plan failed," Jonah stated, looking at her empty hands. "They left the pouch on you." "They did," Aponi confirmed, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. "Maddox was too eager. He and the others dragged me to the parade ground immediately. The proof is still there. In the dust." The butterfly's sting was sharp and deep. Jonah realized his role had shifted once again. He wasn't a rescuer. He wasn't even just an ally. By cutting her free, he had interrupted her plan, but saved her life. Now, he was an accomplice. He was the unexpected variable in her desperate equation. His presence, his gun, his knowledge of the military mind. He was no longer a drifter seeking redemption. He was a weapon that Aponi had just acquired. She looked at him, her gaze direct and challenging, laying the choice bare before him. He could ride away now, leave them to their fate, or he could see it through. He could help her finish what she started. He thought of Rourke's casual evil, of the poisoned spring, of the quiet dignity of these people clinging to life in a cave. He thought of the ghost in his own eyes, the one that had screamed at him in a burning barn. For the first time, he felt that ghost not as a tormentor, but as a guide, pointing him toward the one fight that might finally grant him peace. "So," Jonah said, his voice steady, "we need to get back into Fort Chastity." The idea of returning to Fort Chastity was suicide, and they all knew it, but Aponi had a different plan. Vengeance, she seemed to understand, was a dish best served on home ground. "We do not go to the fort," she declared, standing before Jonah and the elder in the dim light of the grotto. "We make the fort come to us." Her strategy was born of the land itself. It was audacious, dangerous, and relied on a faith in the rocks and wind that went against every military instinct Jonah possessed. He argued for a classic ambush, a narrow pass where his Winchester could command the field. Your way kills men, Jonah, Aponi countered, her voice quiet but unyielding. My way defeats an idea. Rourke believes he controls this land. We must show him it belongs to the spirit that he has poisoned. The chosen battleground was a place her people called the altar, a massive, flat-topped butte that rose from the canyon floor, its sides a sheer drop except for one treacherous, winding path. It was a sacred place, a place of power. It was here they would make their stand. The bait was simple. Jonah. He rode out into the open, a lone figure silhouetted against the morning sun, making himself an irresistible target. It didn't take long. Rourke, infuriated and embarrassed by Jonah's defiance and Aponi's escape, had been scouring the territory with a vengeance. The spotters saw him within hours. The pursuit was immediate and overwhelming. Colonel Rourke himself rode at the head of a column of 20 men, Corporal Maddox at his side, his face a mask of brutal anticipation. Jonah led them on a calculated chase, a desperate flight that was entirely for show. He galloped toward the altar, his horse kicking up a plume of dust, making it look as if he'd been cornered, his flight ending at an impassable rock face. He scrambled up the single narrow path just as the first of Rourke's soldiers reached the base. From the top of the butte, the scene was laid out below him. Rourke, arrogant and confident, ordered his men to dismount. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. He'll climb, Jonah said, taking his position behind a series of boulders Aponi had pointed out. He'll send them up this path, and I'll pick them off. No, Aponi said, appearing silently beside him. Her face was painted with streaks of charcoal and clay, transforming her from the quiet girl into a fierce, elemental spirit. The few able-bodied men and women of her tribe were with her, armed with bows and spears, their faces grim and determined. You will only shoot when I tell you. Jonah gritted his teeth, his soldier's mind rebelling. This was madness. But he had come this far by trusting her. He nodded, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. Rourke sent Maddox up first with half the men. They came up the path single file, rifles ready, their boots scraping on the loose rock. Jonah sighted on Maddox's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger. Wait, Aponi whispered. The soldiers were halfway up, exposed and vulnerable. Still, she made him wait. They were nearly to the top when Aponi gave a sharp, piercing bird call. From the other side of the canyon, an echo answered. Then, the real defense began. It was not a defense of bullets, but of the land itself. Aponi's people, hidden on the canyon rim opposite the path, heaved against massive, precariously balanced boulders. With a deafening roar, a rock slide thundered down, not onto the path itself, but onto the canyon floor directly below it. It didn't kill anyone. It blocked the retreat. Rourke and his men were now trapped at the base of the altar. Panic erupted below. Rourke screamed orders, his face purple with rage. Now Maddox and his men were truly caught, unable to advance into the unknown, unable to retreat. Now, Jonah, Aponi said. Jonah didn't need to be told twice. He fired, not at Maddox, but at the rock face just beside him. The bullet ricocheted, whining through the air, sowing terror. The soldiers flattened themselves against the cliffside, pinned down. At the same moment, a volley of arrows, silent and deadly, rained down from Aponi's warriors on the butte. They weren't aimed to kill, but to wound and disable, to turn the soldiers' confident advance into a painful, terrifying crawl. The battle became a symphony of chaos orchestrated by Aponi. She used the canyon's echoes to make her small force sound like an army, their war cries bouncing from wall to wall. She guided Jonah's shots, having him trigger small rockfalls, kick loose stones, using his firepower not just as a weapon, but as a psychological tool. He was no longer a lone gunman. He was the thunder in her storm. Below, Rourke was losing control. His men were trapped, terrified, being picked apart by an enemy they couldn't properly see. Finally, his arrogance shattered, and he did what Jonah knew he would. He decided to lead the charge himself, to restore order through sheer force of will. He and his remaining men started up the path, firing wildly. This was the moment Jonah had been waiting for. He sighted down the barrel of his Winchester, the world narrowing to the man who poisoned springs and staked girls to the ground. But as his finger brushed the trigger, a pony put a hand on his arm. "He is mine," she said, her voice low and filled with an ancient fury. She held not a bow, but a simple spear, its stone tip sharp and deadly. She stepped out from behind the rocks, a lone figure standing at the head of the path as Rourke and Maddox scrambled toward the top. For a moment, everyone froze. Maddox raised his pistol, a triumphant sneer on his face, but he never fired. An arrow, shot by the old elder from across the canyon, took him clean through the throat. He gurgled, dropping his gun, and tumbled backward down the path. Now it was just Rourke. He stared at a pony, his face a mixture of disbelief and animalistic rage. He lunged, his saber drawn. A pony did not retreat. She stood her ground on the sacred altar of her ancestors. She moved with the grace of a striking snake, sidestepping his clumsy charge, and drove the spear into his side. Rourke roared in pain and fury, stumbling, but he was not finished. He turned, swinging his saber wildly. Jonah raised his Winchester, but it was not needed. A pony was no longer just a girl. She was the wrath of the land he had defiled. She dodged under his blow, her movements fluid and certain, and with a final desperate heave, she pushed him. Colonel Gideon Rourke teetered on the edge of the butte for a single, long second, his eyes wide with the shock of his own mortality. Then, with a scream that the canyons swallowed whole, he fell. Silence. The remaining soldiers, leaderless and broken, threw down their weapons. The battle was over. Jonah stood, the smoke from his rifle curling into the quiet air, and looked at a pony. She stood breathing heavily, her spear planted in the ground like a flag, the painted marks on her face stark against her pale skin. She was the guardian of this place. She had blended his fury with her own righteous power and cleansed her home. The altar was consecrated once more, not with poison, but with justice. The silence after the storm was the most profound sound Jonah had ever heard. It was a silence filled not with absence, but with presence, the presence of justice done, of a spirit reclaimed. Below the altar, Rourke's broken men were being rounded up by a pony's people, their arrogance replaced by the dazed compliance of the utterly defeated. There would be no more poison. Jonah found a pony standing at the edge of the butte, looking not down at the vanquished, but out at the vast expanse of her homeland as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The paint on her face was smudged, and the fury in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, soul-weary tranquility. The spear was gone, and she was once again the girl he had first seen, yet she was irrevocably changed. So was he. He walked to stand beside her, the comfortable quiet between them a testament to all they had endured. The land below seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the soft morning light a balm on its scarred surface. "It's over," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "The fighting is over," she corrected gently, her gaze distant. "The healing begins." She looked at the winding path of the poisoned stream, a pale, sickly ribbon in the landscape. "It will take many seasons for the heart to beat strong again, but it will beat." In her voice, he heard the weight of her new role. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She had faced down the monster and won. She had become the hope of her people, their guardian, their leader. The butterfly was no longer pinned to the earth. It was now responsible for the entire garden. He looked at his own hands. The scar on his knuckle was still there, a faint white line, but it no longer burned with the heat of a guilty memory. The ghost of the Georgia barn was gone. It hadn't been vanquished by violence, but laid to rest by a righteous act. He had fought not for redemption, but for something true and clean, and in doing so, had found what he thought was lost forever. He was a wanderer, a man defined by what he was running from. Now, for the first time in years, there was nothing at his back. He was free. And in that freedom lay a bittersweet truth. He had cut her bonds, freeing her to become the anchor for her people. She, in turn, had shown him his own cage and given him the key. Their paths, intertwined by violence and desperation, had led them to this peaceful dawn, only to reveal that their destinations lay in opposite directions. "What will you do now?" she asked, her eyes finally turning to meet his. The question was soft, but it held the weight of a final chapter. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly. "Keep riding, I suppose. There's a lot of country I haven't seen." The words felt hollow, even as he said them. For a moment, he let himself imagine staying, helping to rebuild, watching the land heal. But he knew it was a fool's dream. He was a man of storms, not of seasons. His peace was found in motion, hers in the deep roots of this place. "You have a home here, Jonah," she said, and it was not an invitation, but a statement of fact, a gift he could carry with him. "The land will remember you." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently brush a smudge of clay from her cheek. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that would forever exist between the gunman and the butterfly. "And I'll remember you, a pony." He turned and walked away, his spurs making a lonely sound on the sacred rock. He didn't look back. He knew what he would see, a queen surveying her kingdom. And he was a stranger who no longer had a part to play. He saddled his horse at the base of the altar, a solitary figure in the vast landscape. As he swung into the saddle and pointed his horse west, toward the unknown, he felt a profound sense of peace. Their victory was not about two people finding a future together. It was about two souls finding themselves. He had been her weapon, and she had been his salvation. And sometimes, that was more than enough. Their two paths, forged in hellfire, now led toward separate dawns, each a testament to the other's strength. In the quiet that followed, life returned to the poisoned valley with the slow, stubborn patience of the wilderness itself. The rains of spring came, washing the earth. The sacred spring, though weakened, began to run clearer with each passing season. Under the guidance of a pony, her people emerged from the caves, not as victims, but as caretakers. Their bond with their home forged anew in the crucible of survival. They replanted, and they rebuilt, their movements filled with a purpose that was both solemn and hopeful. They spoke of the dark time, of the iron-fisted colonel, and of the silent, haunted gunman who appeared like a ghost and fought like a devil. Jonah was never seen in those parts again. He became a whisper on the wind, a story told around the fires of a healing people. Some said he rode north, to the high, cold mountains. Others claimed he went south, disappearing into the deserts of Mexico. But those who knew the story best understood that his destination didn't matter. His journey was complete. He had faced the worst of men and the worst of himself, and had walked out into the dawn, finally free of the ghosts that had chased him. He left behind no marker, no grave, only the legend of a man who found his soul by saving someone else's. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West, where cruelty was often mistaken for strength and power, was its own justification. A different kind of truth sometimes took root. It was a truth that whispered from the canyons and flowed in the mending streams. That courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. And that in the harshest of lands, kindness is not a weakness, but the strongest and most enduring fortress of all.